This module is about critical thinking. Now, problem with critical thinking is we usually think, we're all adults and now you're going to teach me how to think. I know how to think. Thank you very much. Very rational, normal response to this. But before you pass judgment on it, bear with us a moment. Because what's in this module has to do with forming arguments, what evidence looks like when you back up a point that you want to make, and how to carefully craft an argument and think through it clearly to be able to make your point. And this is something that we all need to do, and I think you'll see by the end of this module that so many of us are inclined to skip the critical thinking and just jump to the conclusion. And in fact, we work with people who are inclined to do that, and that can be very problematic and certainly doesn't help us or our organizations to do our best work. So let's think about this as we move ahead. So what is critical thinking? We start with this. It's commonly, just think of it as problem solving. We're solving problems. We solve problems all day, every day. Solving problems is to be human. So this is what we do. Now, what we want to teach you is that teach ourselves really is to not be content with the first solution to a problem or the first thing we stumble across or the first thing we hear, but to think deeply about it. That's what this is about. We want to be able to know, understand, analyze, synthesize, and evaluate a problem or an idea. We want to look at what's implied in a question rather than just the words of what is stated. We'll come to that back to that in just a second. And we want to apply some very simple rules of logic to problem solving. This is not a philosophy course, so we're not going to get too deep into this, but some very, very basic rules of logic and how this applies to how we think about problem solving. And we don't want to let our reason be clouded by emotion. We'll talk a little bit later about human biases, and they're really dangerous because they are human biases. They're built into us, and they are little traps that we will fall into if we're not vigilant to not fall into them. Now, what's involved in critical thinking? First of all is the question, what is actually being asked? Not just the words, but what is actually being asked? How many times have you been asked a question, or it's more likely you'll see it when you ask a question, and it isn't actually answered in the way that you want the answer to be formed? Probably because the listener didn't understand what the question really was. What's the purpose? Why do you even want this answer? What are you going to do with it? Don't ask a question if you don't actually want the answer. I've actually been happy to hear when somebody sponsors research and the question that the researcher asks is, are you willing to accept any answer? Or do you already know what the answer is you want to hear? A responsible researcher isn't going to take on work when the sponsor already knows what answer they want. I can cook my research to be whatever I want it to be, but if I want to be honest about it, it's going to be whatever it's going to be. What point of view? Where do I stand as I look at this question? Management typically thinks very differently from engineering or the sales force or whoever it is we're actually talking about, the customer. Everybody has a different point of view. How do they think about this question? What information do you have to solve this problem? What are the ideas or the concepts that are involved? What assumptions? What are you taking for granted? What assumptions do you have going into this that you don't maybe even intend to prove? You're just going to take them as assumptions. And what inferences are there? So there are facts coming in, and then you infer other things from those facts so that you have a greater deal of facts. So what conclusions can you draw from that? And then finally, the consequences. What are the implications of my question? Are we talking about saving a little money? Are we talking about saving lives? Are people going to lose their jobs? These are all questions that we should be asking about the question. So a few words about critical thinkers. So we're going to go through this list, and everybody listening to this is going to nod their head and say, that's me. But the truth is, it's really not any of us. These are things that we aspire to be, but we're not always. But I want to give you the list. So first of all, we acknowledge our personal limitations. We acknowledge the limits of what we are actually able to do. We know ourselves. We ask questions about ourselves. We see problems as challenges, as exciting challenges. You want to take on a problem. That's a good day to take on a problem and solve it. And you don't just want to solve the problem, you want to understand something. You'd like to be able to solve a problem today so that when you get a problem like it tomorrow, it's easier to solve than it was today because you understand it better. You use evidence to make judgment. That's important to you. You're going to look out, you're going to find evidence that supports or refutes your position, and you're going to work through it logically. You're interested in other people's ideas, so you're going to look at different approaches, you're going to look at other ways of thinking about this. You're skeptical of extreme views. Now, a few words on this. I personally find that extreme views can be very useful in critical thinking. That is to think on the extremes as a way to bound the problem. But what I'm saying here is that good critical thinkers are very skeptical of extreme views. When you're getting into an argument with somebody over some point and they say, everybody thinks this, I'm betting everybody doesn't think this. There's somebody who doesn't think that. Who are they and why do they think that way? Nobody does this. Sure they do. Somebody does. So look at the extremes, be skeptical. Know what the keywords are that tip you off that somebody's trying to push an extreme view. You want to think before you act. So you're not just going to jump in. People who act before they think are the ones who are just jumping on the very first thing that comes to their mind and they move on. You're going to avoid emotionalism. Avoid acting on something because you are somehow emotionally involved in what the answer happens to be. And certainly you want to keep an open mind. Right, so everybody read that last list and they said, yeah, that describes me to a T. So now I'm going to give you a different list on uncritical thinkers, and you're all going to say, well, that's not me at all. But of course, there's a little bit of this in all of us, right? Sometimes we pretend to know more than we really do. We just do. We're not experts in everything, and the problems that we tend to work on are naturally complex. They touch lots of different things. We're not experts in all of them. We sometimes get annoyed by problems. I don't really want to solve a problem today. We can be impatient. We can judge. We can be influenced by first impressions and intuition. Now, if you've read anything like by Klein, for example, and he talks about how expert decision-making actually works, especially decision-making under time pressure, they actually have to. I think he uses examples like firefighters and warfighters that they don't have time to gather evidence and think about what they're going to do next. They've got to act very, very quickly, and those decisions have to be good. So they train themselves to make sure that their first impressions and their intuition is usually spot on. But there's a lot of other decisions that we make that don't have to be resolved that way. So we want to avoid making our judgments on the first impression or just intuition. But we can also often focus on just our own opinions and not anybody else's. We sometimes look for ideas that just look like our own. We surround ourselves by people who think like us, not by people who don't think like us. That's a trap. You don't want to do that. We're often guided by feelings rather than thoughts. This is where we get emotional. We get emotional about things, and we claim that thinking gives us a headache. Oh, I don't want to think today. So my point here is that you got to be vigilant. We've all done these things, so we have to be vigilant to not fall into these traps. A quick thinker's lexicon. These are just some things you might jot down as the key words of what you need to know to be a good critical thinker. What's an inference? An inference is a judgment based on evidence. Something that's plausible is logical or believable or credible, but it's not necessarily a fact. There's a lot of plausible things that are proven to be false, but it means that it has some form of face validity, which is our next word, validity, which means that it's truthful. If it's actually valid, it's more than just face valid. It's valid. That means it's truthful and well-founded. A claim is to assert as a fact whether it is or not. So I make a claim, and it's based on evidence. Well, that's good, but it's not necessarily a fact until I prove it, right? Because a fact is a truth that cannot be disputed. An opinion is a personal view or belief. An argument would be a set of claims that support an assertion. I make an assertion, it's like a claim, and now I provide a set of claims that are going to be supporting claims. So an assumption would be an inference that is believed to be true, but might not be. Now you've all heard these words before, but let's go through them. Yeah, inductive and deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is where we move from the specific to the broad. So the specific, my example, this video game trainer is excellent that we just got. The broad principle, if you just follow inductive reasoning, would be to say, well, all video game trainers are excellent. Maybe we should get rid of all this other stuff and just use video game trainers. Obviously, there's traps there. Now, I'm not saying that inductive reasoning is never appropriate. In some cases, it's the only thing you can do. All you have is a specific, and you have to move to a broad principle. This is what we call the small n problem, right? When you have a small number of samples, and I somehow need to make a broad generalization, I have to use some form of induction to get there. But be careful, because it's very difficult to go from the specific to the broad. What's more likely to work is to use deductive reasoning, where you go from the broad to the specific. And it also has traps. So look at my example. All of the video game trainers we have are excellent. Therefore, this new video game trainer we're about to buy is going to be excellent. Well, you don't actually know that. So that might not be the case. So something called the ideal method looks like this, where you identify a problem, you recognize that a problem exists, then you define the problem to be as specific and comprehensive as you can, and you want to outline all the factors involved. Then you want to explore alternative approaches. You want to gather and explore alternative solutions that might help you isolate on the very best approach, or at least the best given your intuition. You want to act on the best strategies, so take specific action to resolve this problem. And this might even involve more than one strategy, so you can mix and match at this point. And then you want to look back. You want to be reflective and go back and say, don't just think, okay, I solved the problem. You want to look back and evaluate it and say, hey, how did this actually work? Did it work the way I thought it was going to work? What are the right measurements to tell me whether or not my decision-making worked well or not? So another thing you want to be good at to be a good critical thinker is a good question asker. So one quality of a good critical thinker is the ability to ask on-target questions. You're not just, these are thoughtful. You have a strategy for why you're asking questions at the level you're asking them, in the order that you're asking them. And if you find that you're not a good question asker, then think about it. Is it you know, that you're embarrassed to ask questions? Are you worried about what other people will think of you? This is the sort of thing that as you get better at it, you'll be less concerned about what people think about my questions, because you know you're a good question asker and you're doing it as part of a disciplined critical thinking process that you have embraced and that you're using. And you want to make the right inferences. And let's admit it. We make inferences all day long. This is, again, to be human. We make inferences. It's what we do. We look at the world and we infer things about it. Inferences are interpretations that you derive from processing cues in a situation. This is what it is. We do this all day long. A plausible inference is a judgment that is logical and possibly accurate. Might not be accurate, but at least given what you have seen, the cues that you've given in the situation, it appears to be accurate. Sometimes inferences become assumptions, so something we're going to believe to be true and we're going to act on as though it were. You can't prove every possible inference. If we waited to make decisions to ensure that every single thing that we do is locked down, absolutely solid, proven as fact, we wouldn't get a whole lot done. So let's admit also that we have to be able to move through our day and solve problems, not knowing for absolute certain that every decision we make and every part of every decision is based on fact. We just have to live with that. Now, inferences can be tricky, so it's easy to be wrong, and you may operate on faulty assumptions until you're informed otherwise. But this is what it is to be a good critical thinker, is because you will reflect on this and fix your errors. Now, I mentioned bias earlier, and this is something you need to just admit to yourself. We all have bias, and bias comes into what we do. So there are a lot of these. I'm going to point you to a document that has literally dozens and dozens of them that are very, very specific, but just three more or less common ones are, the most common one that I've seen is what we call confirmation bias. So I'm working through a problem. I'm already formulating what I think the answer actually is, and now I start considering only evidence that supports your current position. You're watching a whodunit movie and you think the butler did it, and now everything you see in the movie confirms that the butler did it, and you're not thinking about anybody else. It's not the gardener, it's not the maid, it's not anybody else, it's the butler, because you already made up your mind. in spite of the fact that there's all kinds of evidence there that it was somebody else. That's a confirmation bias. A recency effect is when you weight evidence, recent evidence, stronger than older evidence. Very hard to overcome this because recency means it's in my memory. It just happened. So I'm weighing it more heavily. In spite of the fact that there is something that contradicts it that happened a year ago that is really, really solid and relevant to this decision I'm making today, but I just sort of want to forget that because it was a year ago. That might not be the right answer. It might be that that's the thing that's going to sway your judgment. Gambler's fallacy is when you assume that random events are influenced by other random events. I just flipped a coin and got 4 heads in a row. So the next flip is likely to be a tail, right? Because I just got 4 heads in a row. No, it isn't. It's 50%, just like every other coin flip. So we use this word claim. What are they? A claim is a statement that can either be true or false, but not both. A claim is an assertion you want to have accepted as a fact and not be disputed. So things start as claims, they become facts if they are proven. And when you're evaluating a claim, you only have 3 things you can do with it. You can accept it, you can reject it, or you can wait until you know more about it. Now an argument would be a set of claims. Arguments begin with premises, and that lead to a conclusion. So you're making an argument for, this is a strategy we should use in our simulation facility. Okay, great. That's an argument, and it's based on a bunch of premises, and you're going to start piling facts and making claims underneath that go along with it to try and sway decision makers to fund your next initiative. Okay? A good argument is one in which the premises lead logically to a strong and valid conclusion. People who know how to argue well tend to win a face-to-face argument because they know how to argue. So if you want to form strong arguments, be sure that your conclusions follow logically from your premises. There aren't big leaps full of assumptions that are stuck in between there. You want to leave out the faulty or the dubious premises. You want to identify them and leave them out. Just don't even make them a part of your argument, even if they sound really good. You want to use precise language to pinpoint your claim, and you want to avoid making claims that you can't prove, right? Because if you're called on it, you're not going to. It may throw your entire argument into question, in spite of the fact that all your claims are solid except for this one. And then you want to refine your reasoning. So you want to be willing to argue. You want to be willing to look at other points of view and defend your position, and be willing to change it if you find that you're wrong. You want to use deductive reasoning where possible, but remember what I said earlier, that it does have traps in it as well. You want to check your assumptions all the time. Know what your biases are. Be wary of this because you will not even see them in front of you, but you will be swaying and weighting evidence differently behind your argument based on biases. So to know what your biases are helps you a lot. You want to be a careful observer. You want to stay positive and persistent. You want to just keep working the problem. And you want to not only show a concern for accuracy, but this needs to be almost a part of who you are, that I am seeking the truth. I want the best possible solution to this problem. And I want to take some time before concluding. I want to think through things. I want to weigh it out, especially when we're talking about things like in your job where you could be talking about many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars and major decisions having to do with the direction that your organization is going to take. You want to take some time and be very careful and be a critical thinker. Follow these principles and your results will be better. So a few words on what makes a creative thinker, not necessarily critical. Of course, you want to be critical, but you also want to be creative. You want to actively pursue experiences that are aesthetically pleasing, right? Things that you want to think through things. You want things to have to be tied up nicely. You want logical progression in the way you think about things. You like to take a unique approach to things. You want to think about things. Think about taking a different path through a problem. You love the process of creating, right? You like to be flexible and play around with problems. You want to try different things. When you get a new tool, you like to play with it different ways. You take risks and you want to learn from your mistakes, but you're smart, so you don't want those to be expensive mistakes. You want them to be cheap and fast. That's the type of mistake you like to make. and you strive to evaluate your work fairly. You reflect. And the last thing we're going to talk about here is how to nurture your own creativity so that you're a creative and critical thinker. So you don't want to accept other people's blueprints. Don't let anybody tell you how to think about a problem. You want to be vigilant about what other people can't see. Know what your own expertise is and rely on that, and ask good questions. You want to differentiate from the good from the bad. Be critical, and take the plunge kind of before don't wait till you're an expert before you open your mouth. You want to sort of take the plunge before that, but of course then be fair about what it is you know and what your own limitations are, as we talked about earlier. You want to concentrate on the big picture, take sensible risks, and motivate yourself to work through this. You also want to shape environments that support this sort of creativity. If you end up in a leadership role, you want to make sure that your people who work for you know that to be creative is smiled upon. You want that in your organization. And you want to actively pursue things that people do, not only you, but people who work with you, that are creative in nature. So that's just sort of a nutshell of critical thinking. And again, I hope there's a few things in here that you found interesting. There are many, many books on critical thinking, and I'll give a few references, but there's a reason why there are a lot of books written on this, and there are a lot of people talking about it, is because we don't naturally do it. We like to think we do, but we don't. So be honest with yourself that you don't always think rationally through problems, and sometimes you do act emotionally and without all the facts. And maybe there's a few tips in here that you could pick up on that'll help you to improve your critical thinking skills.